Hi, everybody. I'm here with Ian Bremmer, political scientist, entrepreneur, president, and founder of Eurasia Group, host of G0 Media. Ian, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's start domestically. Talking about political risks. I know you've done some work recently around the media, trust. Let's start there. What's on your radar?
I guess the fact that US democracy and other democracies around the world continue to weaken, continue to become less legitimate in the eyes of their citizens, with very little pushback in the other direction. I mean, it seems that, most weeks and certainly frequently most days in the United States, we have new unprecedented things that are happening that we're just kind of taking as, oh, well, I guess we're here. I mean, so we're now going to probably see an impeachment investigation, an impeachment proceeding opened against Joe Biden in the House of Representatives. Impeachment is, of course, broken as an instrument to constrain overreach of the executive. The purpose is largely to show a twice-impeached Trump running against a once-impeached Biden. And of course, neither side will have any level of trust in what's being put forward by the other. We now have, of course, new indictments, also historic, against former President Trump. If you are a Trump supporter, your view is it doesn't matter what those cases are about. They are illegitimate by definition because they're against your person. And we're seeing people, not just Trump, but also Ron DeSantis, who still is in second place for the Republican nomination, others, Vivek, and others that are saying that if they were to become president, that they would take the FBI out of Washington, D.C., that these have become structurally delegitimized institutions, the DOJ. I mean, at the end of the day, American governance is about an understanding of some common truths among American citizens and a common belief in trust of those institutions. And that, of course, includes the media, as you suggested. And every one of those institutions is eroding. The only question is how comparatively quickly.
And what we can
in other
do
countries
about
too,
it.
of course, but I'm more concerned about the United States since it's my own and since it's happening faster here than I am about other places.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is almost existential in a way. To your point with Trump, we've talked about this before. It seems like, it's fresh fodder for the politics of victimization. To what extent does the media have any agency? I mean, what would you be suggesting if you were in the room with the CEOs of major media companies to address this?
Well, the business model, of course, is not aligned with the promotion of civil society. These companies, a lot of them have been under a lot of financial stress. They are trying to ensure that they get eyeballs. When you had three major networks and you advertised and your advertising revenues were thrown out to everyone and you weren't sure exactly what was hitting and what was missing, but you tried to make good advertisements for everyone and hope that that would make a difference for your product. Today, we've got micro-targeting. We know exactly what works. We know exactly what heats engagement. We know what headlines get people more excited, get people more titillated, get people more angry, and keep them on your site. And that is not aligned with a civic national discussion. It's not aligned with a community. It's not aligned with a family. It's not aligned with anything that brings the nation together. And so, I mean, the reason I'm worried about it is precisely because I don't see macro solutions. I see micro solutions, of course. I think that at the local level, putting news out there that is interesting and relevant to a community where people do know each other, where people will engage in the same sort of conversations and talk about the same things that matter to them, that connect them as people, I think that helps. I think long form helps. But of course, long form is not what happens in a social media environment. I mean, I spend a fair amount of time on looking at the websites of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the websites of CNN and Fox. And if you read the pieces, they're fairly similar. If you look at the headlines, they're radically different. But of course, in the social media environment where most of the people are consuming their news, they're only seeing the headlines and they're not clicking through. And that, of course, means that even if they're on relatively well-researched and documented sites, they're actually only getting the most divisive pieces of the conversation. And look, in part, it's why my TV show is on PBS and why it's long form. And I don't have as many people watching it as I would if I were on Fox or CNN. But at least I know that everything that I put out is a long conversation that forces you to actually engage. Even, I mean, I had an FSB Russian officer who used to run Carnegie Moscow, who I've known for 20, 25 years. The Russian government has sanctioned me. I had him on my show. We spent half an hour together, and I didn't get hate mail. And I obviously don't agree with a lot of what he had to say, but I was able to have that conversation with him so that people at least see what it is that they're saying, what it is that they think. I'm not trying to convince people that the Russian perspective is right, not at all. But I want us to understand what's happening in the world.
You know, one thing, Ian, that I think is interesting, because you talk about risk, one of the biggest risks from the last election, since we're talking about the election cycle, was, of course, the influence of Russia, misinformation. How is that playing out right now? Are you seeing the signals that we're going to have a repeat, or do you think we've addressed those risks?
I don't think that one of the biggest risks in the 2020 or 2016 elections was external influence from the Russians. I mean, I agree that they put some money into it, in the single millions of dollars, to the best of our knowledge, and they developed some Facebook groups which were divisive and helped to drive some violence. I mean, one of the largest Black Lives Matter groups on Facebook, with some hundreds of thousands of followers, was completely a Russian cutout organization. I mean, my God, driving racism in the United States, that is, those people should all be in jail. There's no question. And of course, there's no extradition coming for those folks. But overwhelmingly, the problems of U.S. legitimacy are homegrown. They are a problem of technology and algorithms. They're problems of the media model and the social media model. And they will be problems of AI in very short order, and deep fakes and disinformation. They're problems of identity politics and inequality, and they're problems of political opportunism and those that are acting in performative fashion to take advantage of all of that polarization in the United States. And we're exporting it. We're exporting it to Brazil. We're exporting it to Europe. We're exporting it to Canada. Not intentionally, but again, it's what the model does. So yes, of course, I'm worried that in 2024, where we have two political candidates likely running against each other who are both very unpopular, who are both very old, one of whom, in my view, is completely unfit for any office, Donald Trump. And I felt that way when he was a Democrat. It has nothing to do with his political affiliation. And the level of disinformation. I mean, we just saw today that former Mayor Giuliani, senior advisor to Trump, admitted that he was lying about Georgia election results. But that's not going to change the view of any Trump supporters. As Trump has said, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't lose any of his voters, unless the one he shot was one of his voters. Then he'd be down one voter. But that's it. And I think that we need to be very deeply concerned about what that means for 2024. Irrespective of what the outcome is, because I think that no matter who wins in 2024, the supporters of the loser will believe that the outcome is illegitimate. and some of them will take up violence. And the disinformation that comes from that, the damage of civil society that comes from that, I think is increasingly significant, structural, and lasting.
Well, it's interesting. This is not a unique problem to the U.S. As you mentioned, we've had news this week in Israel with the Supreme Court, the curbs on the Supreme Court's power. How important is that as an issue? Because some people understand the importance of the relationship with Israel, but it does feel distant from what the U.S. is dealing with. How are you seeing it?
Well, of course, it's a tiny democracy. I mean, it's like less than 10 million people, but it's also the most entrenched democracy in the Middle East. It's also the most steadfast ally of the United States in terms of intelligence coordination, military support, technology exchange, you name it. And it is true that Bibi Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government has worked very hard to undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Now, the response of the people in Israel, of the majority of the people, has been widespread demonstrations for many, many months now. They've been incredibly civil and peaceful. They have not led to violence. They have not led to destruction of property, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of Israelis, which, I mean, given the size of the country, is the equivalent of tens of millions of Americans on the streets every weekend. So it's really quite inspiring. And it has forced Netanyahu to suspend and then water down the reforms of the judiciary that are being pushed forward. And the reforms that have just been passed are only one small piece of what he originally wanted. And they involve the suspension of the unreasonable clause for the Supreme Court, which means that the Supreme Court can no longer strike down a piece of legislation because they find it unreasonable in the context of Israeli politics, which is different from finding it illegal. In other words, this is a component of the Israeli judiciary that is considerably stronger than the American Supreme Court, for example. And many in Israel believe that that is too strong and needs to be redressed. And the Supreme Court itself is going to rule on this piece of legislation. And we'll see what happens, because, of course, if they rule against it, it's conceivable you could have a constitutional crisis. Then there's also the inability for the Supreme Court to strike down appointed members of a cabinet of the Israeli prime minister, which is very important for Netanyahu, because if he can put in his own attorney general, that would allow him to end some of the corruption cases that have been pushed forward against him. No surprise, that's something he's very interested in doing. Now, assuming that these pieces of legislation stand up, that is not the end of Israeli democracy, not at all. It is a change in the balance. It is a strengthening of Netanyahu in the context of a multi-party democracy that has very frequent, very weak coalition governments. So if that was all that happened going forward, I mean, you might downgrade Israel from an investment perspective, because all of this demonstration is making it harder to invest there. It's causing disruption, but you wouldn't say Israel's becoming a non-democracy. Now, Netanyahu and his ministers have also said this is just the first step. They intend to continue with these reforms in the fall. The next piece would be to allow the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, to overturn any Supreme Court ruling with a majority vote. Now, if that
starts
happens,
to get past a boundary, definitely. Yeah.
I think that if that happens, you are suddenly in an environment where the executive really has managed to transgress a checks and balances inside the Israeli democratic system. That to me would change the nature of the democracy. It is very clear that there will be a lot of fighting politically and on the streets before we get to that point. But I mean, if you've been worried about Israel, your alert level has definitely gone up on the back of what's happened in the past several days.
Well, Tell me about what's worrying you. I was struck this week when the IMF came out with its latest forecast, and it was 3% growth, which was better than April, and it did suggest some degree of political stability. How are you seeing it? They did warn of black swan events and all kinds of other factors that could, change that number. But are you confident with their outlook?
It's still subpar for what we want global growth to be. It's nice to see that Germany is the only country among the advanced industrial democracies that they are now seeing a mild recession. In the United Kingdom is showing better growth than expected, less inflation than expected, given how bad UK performance has been in the years post-Brexit. That's very welcome. Doesn't help Rishi Sunak in terms of his own potential re-election chances next year, but it's still very welcome for the British people. The US, of course, still looks unlikely, knock on wood, that we're going to be in a mild recession. And generally speaking, inflation numbers, employment numbers, growth numbers still looking reasonably attractive, perhaps over-reflected in recent market gains. The Chinese softness is something that everyone continues to be concerned about. The level of Chinese risk aversion of the consumer population, the focus on continued savings, the unwillingness of the Chinese government to commit to large stimulus, all I think is making people concerned that you're just not getting that driver for global growth that coming off of zero COVID, a lot of people, including the bankers, were expecting you'd get. But of course, for me, I'm not an economist, I'm a political scientist. So leaving aside reading the IMF numbers, I worry about what the near-term tail risks might look like. And certainly if we are in a bigger confrontation with Russia, the Russians in the last several days blowing up barges along the Danube, targeting grain infrastructure, fuel depots, port facilities in Odessa, as well as on the Ukraine-Romania border. Romania, a NATO ally, that is going to increase prices of food all over the world. It's going to hurt the sub-Saharan African economies. It's certainly going to increase indebtedness and lead to potential collapse economically of some of those countries. More money is needed for the World Bank and the IMF to provide support. We'll see what the Biden administration and others are capable of doing. The U.S.-China relationship is negative, continues to trend worse. The potential of that could lead to sanctions that would have an economic impact. So far, the sanctions largely have not. That's a serious concern as well. So I think that the geopolitical tail risks, which are not baseline, but they're meaningful, they're getting larger, are something that we all are concerned about. And we should take any IMF projection at this point and say we have less confidence around the tail downside than we normally would. Really, at any point since the 2008 financial crisis 15 years ago, the downside geopolitical tail risks are higher today.
Now, I know this is one that it's hard to have a lot of transparency around, but North Korea is back in the news, both with this bizarre defection, but also meetings that are taking place with, I believe, the China, Russian defense minister. Give me some sense because that is clearly, volatile, and anytime that those two words come up together, North and Korea, it does tend to put fear in the minds of a lot of Americans and others. What are you seeing there?
Well, the South Korean government, of course, under Mr. Yoon, is much more conservative. They're less aligned with China. They're more hawkish towards North Korea. They are much more interested in expanding their military operations with the Americans and with the Japanese. South Korea-Japan relations are much closer than they used to be. The South Koreans would like to join the Quad. There's increasing conversation domestically about whether or not the South Koreans should even develop their own nuclear weapons. In the interim, the Americans are strengthening their nuclear umbrella with South Korea. Just in the past couple weeks, a nuclear submarine was sent to a South Korean port from the United States. That's a first in a long time. So for all of those reasons, if you're Pyongyang, the orientation of South Korea is looking more aggressive towards you. In response to that, of course, the North Koreans have been providing more military support things like ammunition to the Russians, who don't have a lot of sources for that. So not a surprise they're meeting with the Russians, and they're more willing to meet with the Chinese in part because the North Koreans see themselves as more surrounded by everybody else. That's meant more missile tests by the North Koreans, though we haven't seen a nuclear test so far. That's interesting. They haven't done that in a while. Maybe they will. Certainly, that would cause greater concern and lead the South Koreans to become more aggressive on all the fronts that we just mentioned. I see the defection as, the unusual, obviously somewhat emotionally deranged, spontaneous decision by an American soldier, a private who was under a lot of pressure. He had recently been detained. He was going back to the U.S. to be under arrest, perhaps court-martialed for disruptive behavior. Instead, he decided to run over to North Korea. I suspect he will regret that decision in short order if he has not
sure
already.
he will.
I have no idea if he will be released. This has not happened in years. So, maybe the North Koreans will let him go, maybe they won't. But they now have a chip that they can use in their relationship to the United States. And it's the responsibility of one idiot, unfortunately. And, I feel badly about that.
So I know you're heading off on your summer sabbatical, if that's the right way to put it, to Nantucket. What else is on your radar screen you'd put on ours? Obviously we haven't addressed some of the big issues like AI that I know you look at. Anything in terms of what you'll be thinking about?
I'll have a lot more to say about AI when I come back. There's a really big piece I'm working on that'll be coming out in early September, and I think we'll have some interesting conversations there. But certainly focused very heavily on the U.S.-China relationship, on where it's going, where it's not going. I mean, Kissinger managed to get over there at 100 years of age, met with Xi Jinping, but we can't get defense conversations going on between the two. That is going to get hotter as we get more into the U.S. Political/electoral season. And of course, we'll also be coming up on the COP summit in Abu Dhabi. And that means we're going to talk a lot more about climate change, about whether or not we can get any movement on agreements on methane, about where the world is heading in their carbon emission promises and commitments. The world is moving faster and faster towards renewable energy. That's great. But as that happens every day, I mean, if we're seeing disturbing records on an unprecedented fashion on U.S. democracy, we're seeing only more of that in terms of the nature of our climate. And I mean, you've got ocean water off of South Florida that's 101 degrees. You've never seen that before. You've got over 110-degree weather in Phoenix for 20 days in a row. You've never seen that before. You've got overnight lows at 93. We can deal with it. I mean, the heat deaths are going up. They're still very small. We're not talking about COVID level deaths, but this is a baseline. It's not the hottest ever. It's the coolest it's going to be going forward. And that's the concern. And are we going to make enough of a difference fast enough to prevent this from becoming cataclysmic for hundreds of millions or billions of people? The COP annual summit process is the time to focus on that. Look, I'm very proud as a New Yorker. The United States set up the United Nations. It's one of the things that the Americans have done that I think we should be proudest of. It also makes New York a uniquely global city. We've got many millions of people from all over the world that come to the city, but also heads of state from all over the world that come to the United Nations in September. They don't come anywhere else. And appropriately so. And it's something that we should be leaning into. It's at a time when there's so much fragmentation politically, and there are so many global problems. The UN has become more important than it ever has been in the past. And I'll certainly be spending an awful lot of time getting prepared for the so-called high-level week and for everything that's happening around that agenda.
Great. Well, sounds like a good way to spend one's vacation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation when you're back. Thanks, Ian.
My pleasure. Good. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.
and why it's long form. And I don't have as many people watching it as I would if I were on Fox or CNN. But at least I know that everything that I put out is a long conversation that forces you to actually engage. Even, I mean, I had an FSB Russian officer who used to run Carnegie Moscow, who I've known for 20, 25 years. The Russian government has sanctioned me. I had him on my show. We spent half an hour together, and I didn't get hate mail. And I obviously don't agree with a lot of what he had to say, but I was able to have that conversation with him so that people at least see what it is that they're saying, what it is that they think. I'm not trying to convince people that the Russian perspective is right, not at all. But I want us to understand what's happening in the world.